involved in housing in my mind when I was a child. I'll tell you some of the experiences I had. I grew up in a family of 10 kids, so obviously we needed a house, right? A pretty big one. We didn't have a big house, so we all kind of squeezed into that house that everybody today says, you guys, all 12 of you fit in that house? And I said, yeah, we had to organize ourselves, and it worked. So we grew up in San Jose, and my mom was very a busy woman, obviously, but she also volunteered on Sunday. She went down to San Jose, in East San Jose, and she, we had like this 9-passenger Ford station wagon, and you could fold all the seats down. It was 1958 or something like that, and you fold all the seats down so you could have 9 people fit in it. And she'd drive out to this neighborhood on Sunday in the afternoon and go to this community organization in East San Jose in the Mayfair district. Now the Mayfair district in San Jose was called Sal Se Puedes. You know, like get out when you can, you know. So it was a tough neighborhood. So what my mom had me as her partner, and what we did is we went to this community group. They put groceries in our car, bags of groceries. They gave us an address list, and we drive around the neighborhood and pick up, go to houses and deliver the groceries to people. It was kind of those days version of a food bank. So by doing that, and I was very young, I was like about 10, okay? So we remember all the guys that used to load the cars up with all the bags, and there was one guy that was real friendly. He loaded all the bags, and he put the bags in the car. And we didn't realize, or my mother did, but I didn't realize until like 30 years later who that guy was. And it was Cesar Chavez. He was loading groceries into our car because he was the head of the community services organization. And so when people say, si se puede, si se puede, si se puede, it's based on sal se puedes. It's like turning sal se puedes around. So it's like Cesar Chavez's community, and turn the community around, and you know, you can do it. Yes, I can. You know, yes, I can do it. So the housing issue relates to that in the sense of the emotional context that you have when you get involved in the housing, right? For me, additionally, another thing happened. Our house burned down. So we were all without a house for a year and a half. So we were kind of scattered all over the place, couch surfing, trying to go to school, doing that kind of thing. So, you know, the tears, the pain, not being with the family, the fear, how we're going to survive, all those kinds of things went through me when I was 13 years old. And then another thing happened was for 10 years, I worked as a farm worker. I hoed vegetables in the summer. I was the one white guy out there. And I worked hoeing vegetables with the short hoe, which is against the law now. And we would hoe vegetables, me and my brother Pat, all the way from Kern County all the way to Modesto. And we'd hoe flowers, vegetables, all that kind of stuff. They were growing it for seeds. We were working for a seed company. And in some cases we saw, like the sheriff, especially on the southern part of the area, the sheriff coming up, and he would come on Fridays. And the labor contractor and the farmer would be there, and the sheriff would come, and then they'd have ICE drive up, the immigration truck, which was a light green truck would drive up. And then the people would yell, hey, get out of here, you know, we got the migra. And so everybody would scatter, a bunch of people would leave because a lot of them were not in the community in California, and they were undocumented. So they were doing on Friday because Friday was payday. So it reduced wages at the contractor, who we call Patron, El Patron, we say the Patron. Watch out, here comes the Patron. So we used to see the fear that people had of the whole immigration experience, the fear of government, the fear of law enforcement, all that. And a lot of these people aren't talking about they didn't survive by public assistance or anything like that. They lived in caves they dug in the San Joaquin River, and I actually saw a lot of those caves digging in. They put like their families in these little caves that they dug into the river. So for 10 years we did this, and you know, I wanted to slit the tires of the sheriff, and you know, I probably wouldn't be here because I would have been arrested in the criminal justice system. But I didn't do that. I just got angry though. I got really, really angry. And when the Vietnam War was over, a lot of the guys I grew up with came back and had substance abuse problems and were having problems and actually died, committed suicide, had mental health problems, didn't have a place to live, became homeless, and that kind of situation affected me also. So when you ask the question, why are you involved in this? Why are you involved in this? People look at me and they say, why are you involved in this? See, Jim Beall, why have you spent your whole political career as putting the housing as one of the top priorities? It's not, I don't even have to think about housing. I don't want to think about housing. I'm not interested in thinking about housing. That's the truth, I'm not. I'm interested in doing something about housing. You get the difference? You have a sense of urgency. You want something done now. You don't want to wait. You don't want to wait to have this problem dealt with. You don't want like a bunch of government departments. You want to get it done. So when I talk to my colleagues in the state senate, I say housing is really the social justice issue. It's a social justice issue. It's about justice for people. It's a way to eliminate discrimination. When I was at San Jose State, I joined the housing committee when I was a young person, a freshman. And they assigned me the fair housing. So actually we helped all the students that had Hispanic and black students that had landlords being discriminating. And I was the one that went up to the landlord and told him, hey, we have lawyers, we're gonna sue you for discrimination. And I wasn't so nice, because as you can tell, in my older age, I kind of mellowed out a little bit, maybe. So I wasn't such a nice guy, but I do recall one of the guys I helped. He came into the office, he said, hey, I'm having problems, my landlord has evicted me in 2 days. I said, well, you can't do that. And I said, tell me what your name is. What are we? He says, well, I'm a fifth-year senior. I had to do some other stuff, and I had taken 5.5 years to get through San Jose State. I said, well, what's your name? He says, John Carlos. You know who John Carlos is? He's the Olympic champion. Remember in the '68 Olympics? John Carlos. So to this day, I keep in touch with John Carlos. And John Carlos stood up and sacrificed for social justice, didn't he? So why can't I take that step and do the same thing? So when you ask the question, why you're doing this, you gotta have a real reason. You gotta have a real reason to do it. And so when we did SB3, the housing bond, the governor said, no, we're not gonna do it. And I didn't give up. And I only got a small bond. I didn't think it was big enough. It's not the entire solution. So what we're planning to do is get this bond passed. Then we have the homeless Proposition 2. But it's not enough. No, we got to do more. We got to do more in the legislature. We got to focus on affordable housing. We can't focus on market rate housing or big developers. I'm not interested in what they're talking to me about. I'm not. A lot of people say, oh, you got to have more housing, and then I hear this, we should build more housing and then the price will go down. I say, I heard that before. That's kind of like trickle-down economics. And I don't buy into that stuff, because I'm a trained urban planner and I've studied urban economics. I know it's a lie. It's a lie. It doesn't happen. There will never be housing that's affordable if you believe in that. You have to build affordable housing. You have to finance affordable housing. You have to find sites. You have to have places for the homeless people. So we have on the ballot this time $4 billion for Prop 1, $2 billion for the mentally ill homeless, which is going to be really a tough one. Trying to figure out how to get that done quickly. And we want to get that passed, but it's not enough. It's not enough. So what I say is, we're up against people that want to divert our attention to maybe other kinds of aspects of housing around transit, housing. There's other aspects. I'm not interested. I want to build affordable housing for homeless, people that don't have housing now. I want housing to be a social justice issue, okay? So you understand me now. What's in your heart and what do you believe in? And I think when you talk about housing, sometimes you have to tell people why you're doing it. That's the most important thing. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? So that's why I'm doing it, and thank you very much. Thank you.
During the interwar and post-war periods, public housing itself was deliberately segregated by race. And then the third force is, of course, just violence. So anytime you had African Americans trying to move into predominantly white neighborhoods in places like Detroit or Milwaukee or Columbus, Ohio, they were met almost invariably with some form of violence or resistance. And there's countless stories of that. You can read Hirsch's The Second Ghetto about Chicago. You can read Thomas Subaru's books about Detroit. And I can just recommend some of that literature to you. But what it resulted in was a system of entrenched residential segregation. And we sometimes get this mixed up because we think of the Jim Crow South, and by the way, the NAACP came into existence, their centerpiece issue in the pre-war period, interwar period, was lynching. So we think of the South as being deeply segregated, and it was, but it wasn't segregated by housing and residence. There's a new study by Trevor Logan, who's an economist at Ohio State, that actually went through the census records, which were taken by census takers, house by house. And you can see that in the South was simply not as residentially segregated as the North, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West by 1940, 1950. What happened was between 1900 and 1950, the North, the Northeast, and the Northwest, and the West became almost perfectly residentially segregated. That was not the case. If you look at St. Louis census records in 1890, or Chicago, or Detroit, or Philadelphia, there simply wasn't a lot of segregation. Most African Americans lived in integrated communities and integrated neighborhoods. So what happened was the North is actually the centerpiece of residential segregation. And many of you probably know Dr. King's, when he went north, that's when he faced some of the most intense resistance. In fact, when he went to Chicago, when he went outside Chicago, he said it was the worst he'd ever seen. So, and that's, of course, after leading folks through Selma and so on and so forth. So the context is that well before the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, and well before FIA here in California, residential segregated patterns were entrenched, persistent, and already set. And the problem is that the Fair Housing Act of 1968 has an individualistic tort focus. Individual plaintiffs bring lawsuits against discriminatory landlords or financiers, right? There's no Brown of Board of Education for housing, and there never has been. There never was a systemic structural intervention. Now, the one component of the Fair Housing Act was the duty to affirmatively further fair housing. But until the Obama administration, there had never been an administrative regulation interpreting what that meant. Circuit courts across the country had tried to interpret what that meant, and it had never been enforced or really applied. I'm getting a little bit tangential here, but I just want to provide that context. So you can look at a redlining map, and this is one of Alameda County, right, which was created, helped created by the federal government, and then you can compare it to maps, demographic maps today, and what you find is an incredibly strong correlation. Not perfect, but it's an incredibly strong correlation. What that means is that these federal policies, these state and local policies that reinforce them, actually produce the patterns that we live with today. I actually want to show you something that I could show you a lot of demographic maps. In late October, we're going to be releasing a series of briefs on racial segregation, and so this is the first public unveiling of a couple of maps I want to show you. There are a number of different ways to measure racial segregation. The most common and popular measures are known as the dissimilarity index and the exposure index. Now, the problem with both of these measures of segregation is that you can only look at two groups simultaneously. So you can see how segregated, for example, whites are from African Americans or Asians from African Americans. What you can't do is look at multiple groups simultaneously. That's obviously a problem because the Bay Area is incredibly and richly diverse. Yet it is also incredibly racially segregated. So I'm going to show you this to the public for the first time ever. Oh, not yet. Before I do that, some people call what's happening now the new Great Migration. And what this is a reordering of our urban and suburban and exurban geography. And between really 2000 and 2018, we've seen a powerful demographic trend, not just in the Bay Area, but across the country, of African Americans who are being displaced from traditional African American neighborhoods into these exurban and urban peripheries. Here are some stats on this. There are many more stats. Tony Samara has an excellent report that I'm actually going to show you a snapshot of that you can look up that documents this in more detail. There are other researchers who are looking into this issue. But just to give you a couple factoids, between 1980 and 2010, Richmond, California lost 22% of its African American population. And kind of the paradigmatic example in my view of this is Ferguson, Missouri, which is where Michael Brown was murdered. And between 1970 and 2010, Ferguson went from 1% African American to 70%. And what happened was African Americans were being displaced or moving from the urban core into this inner ring declining suburb of Ferguson. And there's, I have this image up here of the Parliament of Chocolate, the Parliament of Funk, their Chocolate City album from the 1970s. It was called Chocolate City Vanilla Suburb, and Jeff Chang's book has a chapter in it called Vanilla Cities and Their Chocolate Suburbs, just to illustrate that demographic change. Okay. So the decennial census is unfortunately, even by this point, pretty dated, but you can see the decennial census, it's the most accurate. We use ACS, but the margins of error for census tracts in particular are so large. But you can see the decline of the, this should actually, sorry, this should say percentage non-white population. So this is the overall population of Whites actually, according to the 2010 decennial census, are only about 40% of the overall Bay Area population. That's in the 9 counties. So whites are this is a majority-minority community and region, as is the state, of course. And I'll hopefully show you the breakdowns in just a minute. But before I show you the actual segregation maps that we just created, let me just put this in context using the more traditional measures of segregation. So what the exposure index does, and I think it's probably the most powerful for showing you an overall portrait or what does a typical neighborhood look like, is the average white resident of a metropolitan area resides in a neighborhood that's 75% white. Okay? So whites live in white neighborhoods, and they are actually the most segregated racial group. In contrast, the typical, this is national, by the way. The average African American lives in a neighborhood that is 35% white. So these are demographically different worlds. And this chart underneath shows you, you probably can't read it in the back, but what it shows you is that the United States actually became more integrated, and then it has become more segregated. So we have the same exposure index level of segregation in the United States in 2010 that we had in 1950. So that should really dispel the myth of progress on this issue. Now I'm going to show you the maps that I hinted at earlier. So what we've done is we've created these maps using a novel measure of segregation called the divergence index, which was created by a sociologist named Elizabeth Roberto in 2015. And no one, to our knowledge, has not only mapped the divergence index in the Bay Area, there are no racial segregation maps of the Bay Area that exist at all. Now what there are, and you might be thinking, well, I've seen some racial segregation maps. What you've probably seen is demographic maps, but not actually mapping segregation itself as such per se. So what this is a map of San Francisco County. We've mapped all 9 counties, we've mapped the Bay Area, and we've mapped 2 of the major MSAs, the metropolitan statistical areas. What this map shows you, and I hope you can see it, and I'll explain. First of all, the pie chart in the upper left-hand corner shows you the demographic breakdown of the county, and the county is coterminous with the city. And what it shows is that 40%, using 2010 census data, 40% of the city is white, right? 34% is Asian, 5.5% African American, and 15.3% Latino. We're using Latino as a racial category, and by Latino I mean non-gendered, so Latinx. And we've broken down census tracts into 3 categories: high segregation, moderate segregation, and low segregation. The lighter gray shades are low segregation, the middle color of gray is moderate segregation, and the darker shades are high segregation. Now, what are these color boundaries that surround some of these census tracts? What they show is census tracts that are over 75% white in the cases of the yellow boundaries. So the color boundaries that surround the tracts correspond to the colors in the pie chart. The census tracts that cover Chinatown show census tracts that are over 75% Asian. And then Hunters Point Bayview, those are actually census tracts that are over 50% African American. Hunters Point Bayview is actually the most racially segregated neighborhood in the entire Bay Area for African Americans. It does not mean that they have the most or highest proportion of African Americans, but what it means is that it has the greatest divergence from what you would expect given the overall population of the county and the city. So the 5 of the 10 most racially segregated neighborhoods for African Americans are actually in Alameda County. They're in the East Oakland and West Oakland, but Hunters Point Bayview is number 1 in terms of overall divergence index score. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few other maps. This is Alameda County, I just mentioned. So you can see East Oakland and West Oakland and the purple that's around those census tracts. And again, the color coding is the same. So the African American neighborhoods that are surrounded in purple are neighborhoods that have more than 50% African American. And the blue or teal are neighborhoods that are over 75% Asian. And the yellow are neighborhoods that are over 75% white. Now, I just want to briefly point out that, first of all, Oakland is hyper-racially segregated. This is a community, so when we talk about segregation, we're talking about several different things. We're talking about neighborhood segregation, inter-district, inter-municipal segregation, and regional segregation. Why does segregation matter? What is the harm? When we talk about segregation, we're not just talking about the separation of people by race. We're talking about the separation of people from opportunity, from resources, from life-enhancing capacities and public amenities. I went to a talk by the City of Oakland on equity indices, and the speaker did a fascinating job taking pictures of 2 parks in Oakland. San Antonio Park in East Oakland, and Montclair Park in the hills of Oakland. And she took pictures of the facilities, the restrooms, the water fountains, the playgrounds, and the fields. And it was night and day. There were torn, ripped soccer goals. The bathrooms in San Antonio Park in East Oakland had no running water. The faucets didn't work. They had no toilet paper. The playgrounds were dangerous. What does the city of Oakland have to say about this? The city of Oakland's explanation is that it's a complaint-driven process. That is, they spend equal amount of money as long as people complain. And so this is the same city. Most segregation in the United States is inter-district or inter-municipal. That's not the case for Oakland. Oakland is deeply racially segregated and has inequality of outcomes as a result, because we're talking about segregation from opportunity, from resources, from life-enhancing capacities. What I want to point out about Alameda, though, is that it is full of segregated communities. These neighborhoods in East Alameda, these are 65, 66, 67% white. In a county that's 31% white, okay? And these neighborhoods in South, there are actually a number of cities that are diverse and integrated, such as Newark is one of the most integrated cities in Alameda County, in the sense that it actually reflects the demographics of the county as a whole. But you have a number of communities that do not. And so what this means, and what I hope this vividly shows, is that we live in a segregated region. And therefore, it's explainable. It explains intergroup inequality. It explains this divergence of racial inequality and racialized outcomes. I have one more map. I'm not going to have time to go through this and describe some of the cities here, but this is Santa Clara. And again, you see many of the same patterns. One of the differences is, though, you have intense racial concentration for Latinos in a number of the San Jose suburb neighborhoods. And again, these neighborhoods are neighborhoods that are 75% Latino or more in a county that's 26% Latino. So as I said, we'll have a series of we're going to be releasing these maps at the end of October in a series of briefs. There are going to be 5 briefs on racial segregation. The first will have all these maps. It'll come out at the end of October. So let's turn to the affordable housing crisis. What is the cause, right? Well, I don't have time to go through all this, and many of you are familiar with the facts and the statistics, but far too many Californians spend far too much of their income on housing. It's just that simple. 54% of Californians are what's called housing cost burden. And what that means is they spend more than 30% gross of their household income on housing. But a shocking number are what's called extremely housing cost burden, which means they pay more than 50% of their income gross on housing. And this most acutely affects the lowest income groups in California. Right? Over 90% of the state's extremely low income renters are extremely housing cost burden. And this has the most impact on communities of color and reinforces gentrification and displacement. So this chart shows the breakdown of housing cost burdens by race and ethnicity. And you can see this is pretty uneven. 37% of whites are housing cost burden, but 64% of African Americans are, and 55% of Latinos. And this chart is broken down actually by severe housing cost burden and moderate housing cost burden. So a full 30% of African Americans pay more than 50% of their income on housing in California. Sorry, in the San Francisco MSA rather. I do not, I've been given the 3-minute warning, so I don't have time to show you all of these things.
No.
So some of these charts actually come from a report that we just released called Opening the Door for Rent Control, which is on our website, and it talks a lot about the social science research that supports rent control policies. So I'll just direct your attention to that. You can find that on the front page of our website. Obviously, part of the issue is not just the cost of housing, it's the other side of it, is the income side. That we have an economy that's bifurcated, an hourglass economy, in which you have growth of two ends of the income scale, right? Very high wage growth and very low wage job growth. And this chart actually shows the changes in the number of jobs in the Oakland, Hayward, Berkeley MSA in recent years. But what I want to emphasize is there, as Senator Beall suggested, there is an acute shortage of affordable housing. The shortfall falls most acutely at the very low income and extremely low income end. Let me show you, this is actually a graph that we put into a report we released last year on RHNA. I'm just going to give you a little aside on this. From my personal perspective, RHNA as an aspiration is exactly the right model. So if you want to talk about inclusionary zoning or affordable housing, there are a number of models all across the country. The leading model was the Mount Laurel decision and Fair Share in New Jersey, which was initially a state Supreme Court decision and became codified in state law. And a number of loopholes have been closed on Fair Share. So for example, under the Fair Share scheme in New Jersey, cities were allowed to pay other cities to take their fair share. That loophole was closed by John Corzine in 2008. There was also a question as to whether cities should be liable for the backlog. And the state Supreme Court said, yes, indeed, they were. The problem with fair share is that fair share is race neutral in the sense that seniors could, affluent suburban jurisdictions could simply build senior housing and not actually meet the needs of single family parents or large families or multifamily units. And so RHNA actually is the almost perfect model. Now there's the 40B model in Massachusetts, there's the 30G model in Connecticut, but RHNA as an aspiration is exactly right. The problem with RHNA is that it doesn't have teeth. It needs to have stronger enforcement, and this actually shows you so first of all, RHNA creates an allocation, and this allocation by 5 different income segments. Very low, low, moderate, and above moderate, and then there's another category. But what this chart shows you is that the above moderate has actually met pretty close to the allocation that was initially determined. But look at the divergence between moderate income, low income, and very low income. And while I completely agree with Senator Beall that we need to focus on affordable housing for very low and low, look at the gap for moderate as well. That actually places pressure on the demand for a more affordable housing by moderate income people. So I think RHNA is actually the right way to go. The only thing I want to say about RHNA is that in our report, because ABAG and MTC are responsible for negotiating the allocations with the governments, the regional governments, the initial allocations are too low. So this actually understates the problem to a really significant degree. So I'll just direct your attention to our RHNA report called Unfair Shares, Racial Disparities in Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process in the Bay Area. Okay, I've been told to stop, so I just want to say one last thing. Housing is more than a residence. It's the hub of opportunity. It connects people to education, schools, employment opportunities, amenities, and healthy communities. And gentrification and concentrated poverty, for years, sociologists used to talk about concentrated poverty as the greatest harm in the country. That African Americans and other non-whites were concentrated into neighborhoods that had 40% or more concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty and gentrification are flip sides of the same coin. They're isolation from opportunity, from resources and life-enhancing capacities. And if we isolate people of color into the peripheries of these regions where they can't get access to jobs, where they can't reach doctors and grocery stores and healthcare providers, we're going to have an even worse situation than we had a generation ago. And I don't have time to show you the displacement. I was going to show you Tony's maps, but I'll just stop here with this slide on our 5 Ps model, which you can read about later. Thank you.
Have you ever called or contacted your member of Congress, a senator or congressperson, in any way? Okay, most people in the room. How many of you, though, have ever contacted your local decision maker, like a city council member or planning commissioner? All right, y'all are not normal, because there was still the majority of hands in the room. I was looking around, I was like, oh, this crowd's gonna blow this one. But anyway, but that's great. But it was actually slightly less than slightly fewer than the people who raised their hands on contacting members of Congress. And the reason I want to point that out is because I think so often, obviously you all know, but maybe the other people in your community don't know, you can and you should go and talk to and advocate with those local decision makers. You have more pull with them than you do with Senator Harris, who's amazing about representing how many millions of people. If you're in your own town, it makes a big difference. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, about how a little bit of advocacy goes a long way. And mostly what I'm talking about is about interacting with local decision makers in a city or county or local jurisdiction. That's only one kind of local advocacy. We could do a whole class on grassroots community organizing. We could do a whole thing on electoral work. I don't have time for that. I'm going to talk about what I know a little bit more about, which is like how to go and talk to your city council or your planning commission about why affordable housing matters. What we find in our work at EBHO is that opposition to affordable housing, opposition to renters' rights, or housing justice in general, is often rooted in myths, preconceptions, misinformation, many of those, unfortunately, and for the reasons you just heard about, very much colored by racist and classist and xenophobic ideas and tendencies and assumptions. And sure, there are some legitimate concerns about traffic and schools and things like that, but I believe that those need to be addressed and weighed against the need to give people affordable homes, to stop displacement, to allow people to have a stable place to live, and that if we engage in the public sector, we can find ways to have that conversation. And we need to change the messenger, because often the folks who have the most voice with those local officials that many of you have contacted, they tend to be, as a generalization, the more affluent folks in the community. They tend to be the property owners in the community. They're more likely to be white. And so the converse is who's not being represented in those conversations as much. And that's why it's really important that as many folks as possible come on out and say, yes, I want affordable housing. Because one thing that we've heard from local officials is it's often the same 6 folks coming out again and again and again over years, who then put themselves out as the voice of the community and get a lot more play because of that. And when new voices come into that, sometimes those people can break through a narrative of not in my backyard, or a narrative and property rights are the most important thing. And so a little bit of advocacy goes a long way. So how to do it? So I think a lot of times people are intimidated because they don't have the maps and the terms and the really specialized knowledge. And some of the folks who are kind of retired and have a lot of time to, I don't know why, read planning commission minutes or things like that, can be pretty intimidating. You can go to a meeting and you can hear about FARs, that's floor area ratio, AMIs, area median income, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, on and on and on. And you can think, wow, I have no idea what people are talking about, I should just step back. That is the wrong decision for a couple reasons. One is, you can acquire that knowledge. Granted, the world of planning and land use and housing, that's been set up to be almost purposely inaccessible to most people, especially marginalized and poor folks in a community, but you can acquire that knowledge. I love this handout that Rise Together put together for you. It's just a start on some of the terms and some of the places you can go. You can team up with your local advocacy organizations, such as East Bay Housing Organizations. This is what we do all day long. And if you're like, hey, I don't understand these terms, can I get someone to train me? Can I get someone to speak with me? That's what we do. We have a whole guidebook that lays out some of these definitions and these terms. The stack I was going to bring is helpfully on my kitchen table right now in Oakland, but I would be happy to send you one if you want to learn more. And here's the thing, even if you are not the one to learn all the specialized knowledge and the fancy terms, which you can do and should do, you don't actually need all of that to make a difference, for a couple reasons. First of all, as a local advocate, you have the knowledge that matters. You know your life, you know your community, and so you can speak to your local decision maker from those things, and that's what matters most, even more than the data that someone like me can and should come in and provide. The second thing is that you may even know more than the local elected official in some cases, and you are really equipped to go and tell a story from your local experience that is perhaps even more likely to move someone than hearing from an advocate with the data from another community. So it's really important that you value your lived experience as expertise. We're very clear at EBHO, where we train and work with residents of affordable housing to tell their stories, that there is no distinction between expertise and lived experience. Those are one and the same thing. So feel that, be empowered by that, and go and tell your story. Also, don't be intimidated, or maybe be intimidated, but acknowledge that and get past it, by the process of actually going to a council meeting or a planning commission meeting. I know the very first time I went to an Oakland City Council meeting, I was so thrown by the whole process and the intensity in the room that I got scared and I missed my chance to speak. And several years later, I was in a coffee shop in downtown Oakland, and someone came up to me and said, hey, you, I know you. I watch a lot of Oakland City Council meetings on the web. I know you. And it was like, wow, that says something scary about both of our lives. But the point is, I got used to it. I learned. So go, just sit in on a meeting. See how it goes. See what the culture is. See what the procedure is for turning in a speaker card. And if you need help, come to an organization like ours. How do you find those organizations? You've got some of them here. Start reading your local news, your local blogs, and figure out who's getting quoted. Do they seem credible? Check them out. That's one way to start. And if coming and speaking at a meeting isn't your jam, that's fine. Write an email, make a call, get a meeting. These folks are accountable to you, and they do need to hear from you. And in some communities, someplace like San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, council members will get dozens of emails before a meeting. But in a place like Concord, where we also work, they might get 6 or 10. So every message matters quite a bit, and it doesn't have to be technical. It just has to be saying, I care about affordable housing. I want our community to be inclusive. I'm okay with growth if it means that more people can have a home. That's it. That's the only message that you need. So finally, just to say, ways to connect with elected officials effectively. And you just heard from a pretty remarkable one earlier, but just to put out that, I think sometimes we forget on every level of government, elected officials are just people. Decision makers are just people. So what are they going to care about? Number one, are you someone who can vote for or against them? That's kind of a really important one. And 2, are you someone who has some information or some resources or something that they need? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean quite realistically. They might need to look good for a certain way, or they might honestly not understand a particular affordable housing intervention, and they might need someone to explain that to them, or explain to them that yes, poverty is happening in our community. They might genuinely not know that. They might need that information. You can give it to them. And finally, are you someone who can connect to them on their values and on their interests? And you heard that so powerfully from Senator Beall earlier. If you would just be like, oh, he's just a state senator, what does he really care about? Well, he told you what he cares about. And if we're connecting on values and we're connecting on what we care about, which is housing is about racial justice. Nobody should be sleeping on the streets in our community. And you can have all your AMIs and your ADUs, but at the end of the day, let's think about our values as an inclusive community. If you make that argument, you'll go a really long way forward. And finally, run yourself, because I'd love to work with someone. So that's my very short little pep talk. Please look into EVHO to learn more, but you can do it.
I think, just kind of reflecting now on my 4 years involved in tenant advocacy and organizing, I think one of the things that's really remarkable is that our issues have become statewide issues. What felt at the beginning as a very lonely fight, and I work primarily in suburbs and smaller cities, so not in Oakland, not in San Francisco, where tenant protections, rent control are kind of part of the atmosphere, politically speaking. I was working in places where the reactions were initially very hostile, even though we knew this was what we needed to advocate for. And that's what community members came to us and said, we want to work on this, we don't know how. We can't even get a meeting with the city council member to talk about it. As soon as they see that in the email, they're like, we're persona non grata. So that's changed. Now we have Proposition 10 on the ballot. Actually, voters in California will get a chance to weigh in on rent control at the statewide level. Obviously not passing rent control, right? This is one of the pieces of misinformation we're combating, that somehow Costa Hawkins repeal means everyone gets rent control. I wish, but that's not the case. So one of the things to point out is that we really had to fight hard to get tenant protections on the agenda locally, regionally, and statewide. But having done so, at least at some level, at all of those scales, we've opened up now new opportunities, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But first I want to say something about how we did this. How did we go from this being kind of a marginal issue politically, again, at each of those scales, to at least being taken seriously and debated now in major newspapers, on TV stations, in forums that we just really couldn't imagine when I got involved. And of course, this advocacy was going on long before I got involved, but just in the last 4 to 5 years. And the approach that we've taken that I think has allowed us to be successful is we've recognized the power of the local, right? So we've very methodically been building advocacy and organizing from the local to the regional, and now at the statewide level. And that is a different model than a lot of change models typically operate from in terms of how we get policy changes, right? So there's another model, which is kind of the Hail Mary model, right? You build just enough power to throw that Hail Mary and try to get that piece of magical legislation passed, at the state level, it gets passed, and everyone can go home. Right? We know that doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work for low-income people and people of color, that we have to build power locally, that win or lose at the higher scales, we are still there fighting when that fight is over. We haven't dissipated all of that power in that one big shot at the magical legislation that's going to solve everything. And part of what building power means at the different scales means once you actually get people mobilized, whether it's in the city of Fremont, whether it's in the LA, South California region, whether it's at the state, is that you need to institutionalize that power. And that's been an important lesson, right? And what does that mean? Well, it can mean a lot of things, but it certainly means that you need to consolidate the networks that you've created to do what you've done so far. So if you've built a campaign at the local level, you don't want to then put all of that energy and all of those networks into something at a higher level such that the local networks get dissipated or eroded, right? So we've been really focusing on making sure that there are strong local organizations, especially in the newer jurisdictions where these fights have been spreading, that they're supported, and that they know that when they contribute to fights at the regional or state level, they are welcome, but really what their biggest contribution to the movement is to fight locally and build power locally, right? And the way that we've institutionalized that in the Bay Area, now that we've gotten to a certain scale of power, is we've created a regional organization. We have a regional tenant organizing network. It's in its 4th year of existence. It has a steering committee. It has a little bit of funding, which we give right back to local groups to help them build. We meet quarterly. As a general membership, we have about 27 members. Majority of them are local community organizations representing 7 counties, including Santa Cruz County. Again, we meet quarterly. We have a steering committee that meets monthly, and our primary mission is to make sure that local groups get what they need, right? So in a new member group, for example, in Hayward or in Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, which has now been around for a while, obviously, when they form, they come and say, look, we want to do this. We want to talk to groups that have done this before. How do you build an advocacy campaign in a suburb where the local government is controlled by realtors and homeowners? What does that look like? And we can say, well, you know what, we have 6 partners who have done that. So you should meet with them and sit down, we'll set up a call, you can meet with them and talk about how to do that, right? That has accelerated our progress, right? So we now have new member groups that come in, and they can maybe do in a year what maybe would have taken 3 years prior in terms of just getting that download of knowledge and trying stuff out and having access to tenant attorneys, even if there's not one in their city. We have a network that we can bring them to. So we have a network of attorneys, for example, that have done most of the drafting of local ordinances for tenant protections, whether it's relocation, whether it's just cause, whether it's rent control, right? Accessing that kind of legal support in a lot of the smaller cities and suburbs prior to the formation of networks like this would have been really, really difficult, right? Just because the relationships didn't exist across geography. And now we're taking that to the state level. So we have the RTO, the Regional Tenant Network. In the last 2 years, we've created a statewide network. We call it California Renter Power. We had our first statewide assembly in February of last year. We had about 130 people from about 25 cities attend. We did it again. We were very ambitious. Later that year, in Alameda, we had about 450 people attend from over 50 cities. All were mostly tenant organizing groups, right? There were some advocacy groups like Urban Habitat and others, but most of them were just people who had gotten together with other neighbors and said, we need to do something about the renter crisis. We looked around at what would work for us, and we've landed on what most of the others have landed on, which are tenant protections, and we want to talk to other people who are doing this. And we saw this year the attempt to get about 12 new rent control initiatives on the ballot. And most of them were in Southern California. They didn't make the ballot, and I tell them, look, don't worry about it. This takes practice. Very few things work the first time, right? And we often hear from local media or council members like, well, you know, you either didn't get on the ballot or you got on the ballot and lost. You tried it, so clearly this is going to work here. And we say to that city council person, how many times did you have to run before you got elected? Did you run once and get elected, or did you have to then, did you lose and have to try again? So while most of the ones this year did not get onto the ballot, virtually every one of them is going to try again. And eventually they will succeed, because the mechanics of getting on the ballot are just something you need to practice and learn. We do have 2, one in National City in Southern California, one in Santa Cruz here up in Northern California. That'll be out on the ballot in November. We've also created opportunities at the state level. So in the last couple of years, we've seen the attempt to get Costa Hawkins repeal through the legislature. That didn't go anywhere. We've seen even an attempt to get just cause through the legislature. That didn't go anywhere. And I think that's an important instructive lesson for our member groups, whether regionally or statewide, which is that even a law that would just say, if you want to evict someone, you got to at least tell them why, could not get out of committee. Like, it went down in flames. Like, why is it so difficult at the state level, given the severity of the housing crisis, given the attention that we now have shown on the renter aspect of the housing crisis, for legislatures to even consider a bill that would say, hey, if you want to evict someone, you got to tell them why, so they know at least what they did wrong, or that they did nothing wrong, right? So part of why we see Prop 10 on the ballot is because we've learned that we're not going to get anything meaningful probably at this point through the legislature. Now that might change, right? And we have to think about a point at which that looks different. But currently, we are not in any position to kid ourselves into thinking that we will get that kind of change through elected representatives. From what I hear, I haven't confirmed it, 1/3 of legislators at the state level are landlords, so take that for what it's worth. At the same time, we're also continuing to support more and more local initiatives, local campaigns. So we continue to see those grow. I would say probably every month we get a couple of calls from around the state of a new organization that's formed. We're beginning to do outreach and hear from people in the Central Valley, places like Modesto, Fresno, where people are like, well, rent control doesn't matter out there. Well, to some extent that may be true, but certainly tenant issues matter out there. And Fresno actually launched and won a really important code enforcement campaign, I think last year or the year before, because of the horrible conditions for many apartment buildings for low-income tenants in Fresno. Clearly not caused by rent control because they don't have it. So some of the challenges that we continue to face, I think the main one, I only have a minute left, to point out is the huge amount of money that big real estate pours into local campaigns, into local elections. The flood of money into small cities and suburbs, the flood of money into small cities and suburbs that we've seen as a result of our organizing is just astounding. We're typically outspent 10-1. In Mountain View earlier this year, the landlords tried to put a ballot initiative on in November that would repeal essentially effectively their rent control measure, which was passed in 2016. We heard at the end they were paying $40 per signature to try to get it on the ballot. That was the mayor of Mountain View, Lenny Siegel, was the one who heard that and said it in the paper. So the amount of money is enormous, and so we need to contend with the fact that at the local level, as the movement continues to grow, that we will see that kind of flood of money into the local elections that we need to deal with, and that's tied to a number of things from mobilizing existing kind of old boy networks and media and so on that we have to contend with. But just for the record, Mountain View tenants and allies were able to stop the repeal from even getting on the ballot this year. So let me just stop there. Huge progress. We've shifted the culture, which I think is key. We've made tenant protections and rent control part of the conversation. We've seen allies like the Haas Center now put out reports that are helping to amplify and expand that political space. So we just have to keep at it. If we keep at this culture shift, the politics and the policy will follow. Thank you.
What Nelson Mandela has said, that poverty is not natural, it is man-made and can be eradicated by the actions of human beings. Over the past 2 years, Ensuring Opportunity has been engaged deeply in housing advocacy because we firmly believe that everyone deserves a safe, stable, and affordable place to call home. But we know that too many of our community members, for them that's not the case. They don't have a home, or they're struggling to keep the roofs they do have over their head. Ensuring Opportunity believes in a comprehensive solution to the housing crisis, which involves much of what's up here, the protection, production, preservation, and I'd like to add those power, place, and placement keys. So I think those are important. But today, I'm going to follow up on what Tony has been talking about around the protection. I will share a little bit about Prop 10, the repeal of Costa Hawkins. Before I get further, I just have some questions for the audience. How many of you, please raise your hand if you have any family or friends who are struggling to find an affordable place to call home. It's a lot. Please raise your hand if you want to live in a stable community where you know your neighbors. Please raise your hand if stopping displacement and keeping families in their homes is important to you. Great. Well, I'm excited to say that there's great news that there is something we can do to keep families in our community stable. That is repeal Costa Hawkins. As you heard from Tony, we can do a lot of work at the local level to protect tenants. But one of the things that we need to do right now is address the state limitations on what local communities can do to protect renters and keep families in their homes and in the communities that they cherish. So Prop 10 is a statewide initiative that restores the right of local communities to protect all renters and families from skyrocketing rents. As you've heard from from several folks today, too many families are paying over half their income on housing. California has the 5th largest economy in the world and the highest poverty rate in the country when you factor in housing costs. There are almost 6 million renter households nationally, and more than 1.7 million, but of those, more than 1.7 million households pay more than 50% of their income toward rent. I believe that's simply unacceptable. Living paycheck to paycheck makes it nearly impossible for these families to simply make ends meet, much less save for an emergency. Because of this, many families have to make tough choices between basic needs. Just recently, someone was sharing with me that they eat every other day after paying rent because they simply can't afford food. That is not, sorry, I get really emotional about this, because that is not the way someone should have to live. To compose myself. Many of the people who are the foundation of our communities, like teachers, nurses, and firefighters, are forced to move away. I have lost family who's moved away from this state because they just simply cannot afford to be here, even though their networks, their jobs, their schools are here. And many more are forced into homelessness. But I'm positive now because there is something we can do to create stable and grounded communities where all families can grow and thrive. That's Prop 10, and other rent control and just cause policies that Tony has talked about. Prop 10 will allow local governments and local communities to decide what works best for their community. It does this by repealing the Costa Hawkins Act. Costa Hawkins is a 1995 Pete Wilson signed law that created loopholes in local rent stabilization laws. It denies families rent control protections if they live in a single family home, if they live in a building built after 1995. 1995 was the year the law was signed, so arbitrary. And they move in, and it denies them rent control when they move into a new rent controlled unit. That is known as vacancy decontrol. It means landlords can raise the price of a unit to any amount after a rent controlled tenant moves out. Rent control simply allows for fair and reasonable rent increases while preventing huge, unfair, or unexpected rent increases. Prop 10 does not mandate rent control. It does not force any community to adopt any rent control ordinance that would not be a good fit for their own housing situation. And it does not force any one-size-fits-all solutions on any city. It doesn't establish new housing policies. It simply lets local communities decide what works best for them for protecting renters and stabilizing their communities. Prop 10 is supported by a number of trusted and reputable organizations, including some of the folks that have spoken today. It's supported by the ACLU of California, the League of Women Voters in California, Policy Link, Western Center on Law and Poverty, California Nurses Association, Nonprofit Housing Association of California, and others. We need a broad range of solutions. But we first must start by protecting already cost-burdened renters from huge rent increases and displacement, while we're also increasing the needed supply of housing. We need to put a brake on increasing homelessness. Prop 10 will make it possible for local communities to create rent control policies that work for them to create stable and grounded communities where all families can thrive. Prop 10 is about belonging, it's about justice, and it's about fairness. So I hope you will join me in voting yes on Prop 10 and also encouraging your friends, colleagues to support Prop 10 and come find out more how you can get involved to ensure that we pass this at the state in November.
My name is Will White. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs for United Way Bay Area. We are an organization that represents 8 counties in the region and is deeply invested in disrupting the cycle of poverty. No big surprise that the high cost of housing is one of the largest drivers of said poverty in our region today. So it's absolutely essential that we as a poverty organization take a strong stand for increasing the amount of affordable housing that's available. So I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusionary zoning, but before I do that, I want to make a big disclaimer that I am by no means an expert on inclusionary housing at all. What I am is merely an advocate with a huge crush on a policy idea. So I'm gonna get in my feelings a little bit here, talk about my new crush, so just bear with me. So inclusionary housing, for those of you that don't know, I'm sure many of you have already heard of this term, is a zoning ordinance that local jurisdictions, cities and counties have at their disposal, which would require that any new development, any new residential development within their jurisdiction set aside a certain percentage of those units as affordable. Affordable being defined as usually a percentage of the area median income, which is going to fluctuate across the region. You know, in San Francisco, it's going to be much higher than it is in Oakland, Contra, Costa, Marin counties, etc. So this is a really great tool to work with new development and ensure that at least a percentage of those new units that are being built are going to be set aside for low-income working families. Now, this is not a new idea. Inclusionary ordinances have been around for forever. Well, not for forever, I'd say 30 plus years. But that's just me and my hyperbole. I'm getting in my crush again. Cities for a good number of years in California have not been able to enforce inclusionary policies, despite the fact that they've had these on the books, many since the 1970s. And this goes back to a court case colloquially referred to as the Palmer decision. The Palmer decision was a lawsuit filed by a developer in Los Angeles, sued the city, claiming that their inclusionary policy was in violation of the Costa Hawkins Rental Act. That court decision ruled in favor of the developer, and ever since then, it's been very unclear and for cities and how they can enforce their inclusionary policies. So basically, they haven't been able to enforce them when it comes to new rental housing development. Now, fortunately, this year, the state legislature, a bill was passed last year that became effective this year, allowing inclusionary policies to go forward here in the state of California and providing clarity for cities and counties on how they can enforce them. That bill that went into effect is called AB 1505, and it allows local jurisdictions to adopt up to a 15% inclusionary ordinance without triggering an economic review by the state's Housing and Community Development Agency. Now, with one caveat, some cities can go higher, provided that they've met certain criteria in the past, but we can go into the weeds about that in the question and answer period later on if you're so interested. Now, this is really a critical tool for local jurisdictions because, you know, I want to just make sure that, you know, we're thinking about who we're building housing for. I think is really what this boils down to. In those communities where housing is getting built, I think that we as advocates and we as communities need to make sure that we're thinking about what kinds of folks, what kinds of families housing is getting created for. Are we going to build all glass, 1-bedroom condominiums for tech workers? Or are we going to build 2- and 3-bedroom apartments for working families that are struggling to make ends meet? Are we going to help to stem the tide of displacement that is ravaging this entire region? Are we going to help to make sure that our communities can stay together and thrive in the communities that they've been in for so many years? And inclusionary ordinances are just one more tool to help us achieve those goals. I want to go like lightning, because this is a lightning talk, so I'm going to keep it brief here. But I just want to close with some really brief remarks that really echo what some of the other speakers have mentioned here today. And that especially when it comes to things like inclusionary ordinances, I think it's really easy to get caught up in things like percentages, number of units, number of bedrooms, placement of units. And I think we always need to remind ourselves as advocates that this is really about people, first and foremost. This is about families, first and foremost. So I think we should all keep that in mind as we move forward with this. And I look forward to talking with you all more about inclusionary zoning.
I'm going to be building, again, on what some of my colleagues have already discussed about the changing shape of our region. And well, first off, BARHI is the Coalition of Public Health Departments in the Bay Area, and we're dedicated to improving health equity in our region. And if you have more questions, I'd love to talk to you about it at another time. So this is how we tend to think about the Bay Area. This is life expectancy by birth, by neighborhood, and you'll see there's about a 25-year difference by census tract. That's the difference between seeing your grandchild grow up or not. That's not okay, and that's something we need to fight, and our work is dedicated to trying to change this. Another thing you'll notice, this is actually from 2010, and a lot of the red, this is where we have pretty poor health outcomes and life expectancy. And if we looked at newer data, and as we do look at newer data, that red actually starts to migrate outward. And that's because housing costs are so intense, and the displacement epidemic is so intense right now, that a lot of low-income folks, communities of color, are now being pushed out to the fringes of our region. And it changes what we need to be doing and thinking about on housing issues. I'm going to kind of breeze through this, but this is how we think about health. Traditionally, public health is thought about like stuff more in the doctor's office, health behaviors like smoking, healthy eating, and we've helped push the conversation up into thinking about things like housing, like social inequities, like power, and that actually as health departments, if we're going to get things right and improve health, we need to be addressing those issues. Quickly on housing and health, we know that when low-income households can comfortably afford their housing, they spend more on childcare, they spend 1/3 more on healthy food, and they spend 5 times more on healthcare. Like 5 times. We also know that there's really severe impacts on families. So families are twice as likely to get evicted, and once evicted, a family is twice as likely to be in poor health. We've done some recent research, which I'll plug, and I have copies of these family health and housing briefs. And in looking at the data, we found something really interesting, which is actually the percentage of families with young children that are rent burdened is actually a lot higher in some of our suburban counties. So Contra, Costa is actually the highest, which is really interesting and really disturbing. And that's borne out by other data. So for instance, between 2014 and 2016, there were more evictions, formal evictions, than fit in the Contra Pavilion, in Contra Costa County alone, right? So these are suburban jurisdictions that we may not be thinking as much about. There's like less of a history of organizing and work around tenant issues, and yet this is what we're seeing. And we're seeing that because of some of the patterns that folks have mentioned earlier, really strong displacement pressures. And this is some of the work from the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley, looking at risk and displacement patterns by neighborhood. And so this gets to, again, some of the data that was presented earlier. This is percent change in African American population from 1990 to 2010. And what do you see here? Wow. Yeah, whoa, right? So the blue is places that we've seen a real over a quarter or about a quarter loss of the black population. And, sorry, this is a little ungainly. So what we're seeing is big losses in a lot of the core Bay Area cities where organizing and tenants' rights have typically been really strong. And a lot of folks moving out to East Contra Costa, Solano, and then further out into the valley. And what this means from a health perspective is it's really hard for our health departments to take good care of people when they're like super spread out. Like I used to work in East Contra Costa, now I'm working a lot in Vallejo. It is really hard to do a good job of keeping people healthy there. It's also really hard to foster advocacy. Like we're working alongside Tony and Urban Habitat to help build up some of the housing voice in Vallejo. Like we'll be having a little thing tomorrow. And it's really difficult. There's very few resources. People live far apart. People often commute back to churches where their grandparents used to go or their parents used to go. So some of the traditional sites of organizing just aren't there, or they're more spread out. We also know that as displacement picks up, it's fueling it's fueling homelessness as well. So there's some really interesting research going on now, ethnographic research in Oakland, that's pointing towards the fact that as Black families in particular are displaced out, that many of the folks, like potentially like an uncle or family member that were staying with them, are now out on the streets. And so building out the linkages between displacement and homelessness is really important. In response to these things, we think that we need to borrow some lessons from public health. So in the health world, when someone comes in to the hospital or emergency room, what do we do first? First, we try to treat whatever the most acute thing is. So in this case, we gotta protect existing renters. Then we try to stabilize them. So in this case, like preserving existing affordable housing, stabilizing our neighborhoods. And then we try to think about like long-term, how do we get this person healthy? And in our region, that means thinking about building affordable housing and resolving some of these like longer-term things. So we need all of those strategies, and we need to be thinking about the sequencing. These are some goals from CASA, which I'll let Julie talk about in a little bit. This is a regional process. Yeah, I'm just gonna punt to you, Julie.
Thank you.
But these are some of the goals that we've developed around like what it actually will take at the regional level, and it's many billions of dollars annually. From a public health standpoint, again, we really want to be concentrating a lot of our protection efforts in kind of the core Bay Area places that were already facing strong displacement efforts, and then start moving to these areas in gray and resourcing them, in preserving the housing that's still affordable there, kind of locking it down before market pressures get too intense. For us, that looks like working with community organizations to expand the capacity to define needs, figure out what the problems are, develop local solutions, working with leaders, planners, developers to actually build some affordability. And then we see a particular role for the health sector, both public health and health more broadly, medical health, to be contributing resources, investment strategies, and an advocacy voice to help address the housing solution. And I can go into a lot more detail about what that strategy looks like. We can cover that in a small group. But in particular, we want to be thinking about preservation strategies in some of those parts of the region that are still relatively affordable. And I will end there. Thanks, everybody.
Santa Rosa is the 5th largest city in the Bay Area and was recently found to be the 19th most expensive city in the world. San Francisco is the 14th. I would guess that we have about a 40% minority population, around 30% Latinx, 47% renters, and because we had significant fires just about a year ago, we lost 5% of our housing stock, and we saw cascading renter displacement. People who owned homes and had lots of money displaced the next level, who displaced the next level, who displaced the next level, and saw increasing homelessness. We tried, I was the person who brought forward our rent control ordinance. We tried, the council passed rent control, the California Apartment Association took it to a special election. I will say they lied about what it was going to do and what it was going to cost. They were very effective. They put $1 million into this campaign and they overturned it through a special election. We lost that election by 800 votes. Vote, make sure your neighbors vote, run for office, make sure your neighbors run for office. And while I have a second, which I don't really have, don't just talk to your allies on councils. I have to have 4 votes, and I have 2 votes that are wishy-washy. Okay, in my council of 7, I have 4 votes sometimes. if you only call me and tell me what you need in housing, I won't be able to get it done, because I need you to talk to my 2 wishy-washy council members, okay? So, sorry to put it that way. So, CASA is the committee to house the Bay Area change, have key constituents all agree on things, have both positive and negatives that we agree on, and be bold. I'm hoping that we actually do these things. We're looking at shared responsibility, balancing among the 3 Ps, be fair, be effective, be inclusive. So you all know the 3 Ps, and thank you to NPH for these slides. You know these, so I don't need to go through them. These are the co-chairs, and you probably know these folks. Fred from San Francisco Foundation, Leslie from Silicon Valley at Home, Michael from TMG Partners, that's a development company, and Steve from the Metro Bay Area. The co-chairs have made statements about what they want to have happen with CASA. They're big. I don't think consensus is maybe the right word, but at least we're hoping that everybody has something they both like and dislike in a package. The idea is that the package goes forward. So this is the package we'll be talking about more. This is sort of the sales pitch for the small group. There are 17 items in this package. Yesterday, we got some of this material as the steering committee. So I'm still going through it all too. Of these 17 items, you'll notice there's sort of parenthetical remarks, whether it's protection, preservation, or production. Let me say that in my personal opinion, this is a developer, a slightly more developer, I'm trying not to use the word balance, there's a leaning toward developer interests within this entity. We do have some wonderful groups, Six Winds, Bar High, that are bringing in equity issues, but I think the equity issue and the equity overlay is difficult at best, and we need your help in making sure that CASA picks up the equity issues. So please contact me, contact Will, contact Pedro. Please get in touch with anyone you recognize from the CASA website and help us move this more toward the equity side. You'll see that Just Cause, they're not calling it rent control, they're calling it anti-gouging cap. So they're talking about a number between 5 and 10%. Let me tell you that my own city has a 10% and it's not helping very much. 10% is a horrific amount to have your rent go up every year. Right to legal counsel. You should remember that the very California Apartment Association that ruined our rent control ordinance took to the legislature a piece of legislation that luckily failed, that asked that cities could not provide legal assistance to tenants. So this is an association we really have to work against. And I'm sorry to have to put it that way because there's a lot of kumbaya, let's get together and talk with apartment owners, individual apartment owners, mom and pop apartment owners, go ye forth. But the California Apartment Association will not be our friend in this. No net loss is an important factor. I think we're gonna really have to fight hard to get no net loss. That's number 5. Things that concern me include number 16, which is taking the liability away from developers and builders. I went to one of the 3 co-chairs, the one who happens to be involved in direct development, market rate development, and said, how about we put a cap on the % profit that a developer can make since we're going to give all of this stuff? And he said to me, but if I have the liability, then why shouldn't I have access to all the profits? He was ignoring the fact that he was getting a bypass on liability. So we'll talk about these in more detail in the 20-minute briefing. I did want to show you the overview in a slightly different format, looking at the tenant protections, looking at the housing element pieces. There's a real interest in what they're calling the missing middle and adding that to the RENA. That could go very well, and it could certainly go south on us. We want to make sure that we still keep RENA going only to 120, and that if they need to add a category from 120 to 150, we add it, but that we don't make the category 100 AMI, area median income, to 150 as a whole block, because we're gonna miss the people from 100 to 120, and we're only gonna get the higher end of that. This is my cynical approach to these things. I apologize for standing here and being a little cynical to you. We estimate that there's a $1.68 billion gap in funding for affordability, and this is for the 2 lower levels of affordability within our 9 Bay Area counties regions. To put that in perspective, I want to show this slide. This is how much on the right we're paying for transportation. On the left of that bar chart is what we're paying for housing. We love our cars. We love our transportation. You have seen today how transportation is going. And look at how well it's funded. How must housing be going if transportation is such a disaster that it took me an extra hour to get here today? So we need MTC, which is the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, through its various arms to fund housing where jobs are so that we don't have as much transportation issues. There's a suggestion for how CASA will be funding the compact. Each of these little boxes is about $100 million to get us to the 1.68 billion. It's interesting that philanthropy doesn't have a $100 million mark here. And we did have questions from the employers asking if they did philanthropy, could they get a pass on doing the other things? So we need to look at these, whether we're going to be able to get these through the legislature, which pieces of these are we going to work forward. Local this is theory for how it might be spent. If we got 1.6 billion, we don't have it, so it's kind of fun to think about how you're going to spend money you don't have yet. So let's look at it that way. Obviously, I come from a local jurisdiction, and I'm feeling like 10% isn't enough. And I'm about to wrap up. One of the big implementation pieces includes a regional housing entity. Here are the next meetings for CASA if you want to come and make public comment directly yourself. I have another slide, but I'm going to leave this one up so that you can write down the times and location of the meetings. Please come and make public comment. Thank you.
1 in 3 Californians can't afford their rents right now. Zuleika brought up earlier that California is the world's 5th largest economy. To put that into context, California just by itself has more money than the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has universal health care. The United Kingdom has social housing. Why can't California house its residents? We have an abundance of money. Why do we have homeless encampments? Why are people sleeping on the streets? We need to do better as a state. We just do. And so I'm here to ask all of you as voters, or if you're not voters, if you can let someone who can vote to vote yes on Props 1 and 2, because they will help at least provide some resources to begin getting us towards addressing our state's severe housing and homelessness crisis. And scroll up, and that crashed. Okay. And so these 2 measures will collectively raise about $6 billion for affordable housing. And what that means in really tangible terms is thousands of new units affordable to our working families, our veterans, our seniors, our people with disability, as well as dedicated funding to help people experiencing homelessness put a stable and safe roof over their heads with services, so that they can get the help that they need to be housed permanently. And so Prop 1 is the measure that has about $4 billion worth of funding. As I mentioned earlier, it will provide housing for veterans, people with disabilities, working families, and it will go towards funding many of the existing state programs that have in the past had the resources to at least provide more housing than none, but which were taken away over the years, and now this will help at least backfill that so the state can do a little bit better. And Prop 2 is focused specifically, Prop 2 is focused specifically on people experiencing homelessness and chronic homelessness, a third of whom have severe mental health issues. So this will go towards funding housing that's not only affordable to them, but has services so that those folks can not only have a stable place to live, but get the help that they need to be permanently housed. And so when we looked at this back in January, and we polled Californians to look at their support for Props 1 and 2, we found pretty solid support. About 60% of Californians said that they supported Props 1 and 2, actually, since you corrected. But this is great. This measure only needs about 50% of voters to support it to pass, but we really need to knock it out of the park. And the reason I say that is we can't just afford to have this pass, no pun intended, to have this pass with a 50% majority. We need 70%. We need to go as high as we can because we have a new governor coming in. And as traditionally has happened, housing has always has been a back burner issue. Now it's gotten so bad that everyone is impacted that, oh, lo and behold, housing is a problem, people need a place to live. So we need this to be voted on by as high a margin as possible, so that way when the next governor comes, we can say to them, hey, you need to keep resourcing affordable housing, we need bills that make it easier to build, and we need to make sure that every single one of our communities is doing their part. And so, there's a couple things that you can do. Luckily, lots of folks understand the impact of these measures, and 317 Bay Area organizations have already endorsed them, including the cities of San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Santa Rosa, thank you, and many others. And so there's a lot that you can do individually or your organizations can do, which is if you work for any organization that has any following of any kind, have you endorsed these measures yet? If you haven't, then you should consider endorsing. Have you encouraged other organizations to endorse, other groups that you work with? Do you have newsletters and social media? Can you help get the word out? And if you have any questions around the material to put out to your members, we are so happy to provide that for you, so please contact me or anyone at NPH. You can host a community event to support Props 1 and 2. And finally, you can get directly involved with the campaigns. And our NPH's Director of Advocacy and Political Engagement is helping lead some of that work, and we can put you in touch directly with him, and he can get to the materials you need to be more involved with the campaigns directly. And this slide here, which I am happy to share with you, has the names of people leading the campaigns locally in all 9 counties. As I said earlier, this is a statewide campaign, and we need every single one of you to turn out, to get your neighbors to turn out. We need this to blow it out of the park, and these folks are able to help you. So with that, I'm happy to answer your questions in the 20-minute session. Thank you so much for your time.